Now, the Law of One doesn't quite say this in so many words, but here's what we have heard. Now, this information actually came to me in part through the highest level insider who's been talking to Richard C. Hoagland, who's been out there ever since the 80s talking about all this stuff. And this guy actually was authorized by the United States government to leak this to me and other people who are out there as UFO figures, because apparently the powers that were now feel that it's time for us to know this. And I've taken the ball and run with it. And then after he gave me all this information, these two brand new insiders from the space program showed up, and between them and all of their friends, I got a lot more than what Hoagland's insider was willing to give me. So here's the story from Hoagland's insider, who's been talking to Hoagland ever since he showed up in the 80s. And everybody else, I've put it all together, and these are people who, overall, there's up to 100 different points of correlation between these different stories. And I withhold a lot from the internet, because there are unscrupulous individuals out there who will take this and say that they're insiders and then want to go out there and bilk people out of their money. And say, well, you know, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to do that for you, buy into the bonds that will be worth something when the Federal Reserve collapses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have to withhold a lot of stuff, because otherwise everybody's going to say they know it, and how can I vet people out? So I've vetted out these guys, and I've not released most of what they said. This is a big new data download, and so we're going to look from here on out and see how many people all of a sudden know all the things that I just told you tonight. Right? That's going to be a telling clue of whether they're real or not. They suddenly change the story. What do we find out? We find out that because of the unique nurturing energy that's in our solar system, this is used as a sort of a rehab colony for negative groups. They were banished here by ETs from other worlds, other solar systems out there, that said, you guys are too warlike, get the heck out of here, we're sending you over there to rehabilitate. We're going to put you on a nice desert island. So we're Australia, we're Botany Bay, okay? Our solar system was a prison colony. Now they didn't, the good beings that did this didn't think of it that way, but the people who got sent here had a lot of enemies, and they pissed a lot of people off. Now, these original people had spent many, many, many millennia in space. And the longer you stay in space as a human being, because one of the things we learn is that everybody that is an extraterrestrial is some kind of hominid. They got a head, they got arms and legs. They could look a lot different than us. Every type of life that we see on Earth, whether it's birds, whether it's fish, whether it's reptiles, insects, every type of life on Earth has beings that look human or human-like that are derived from that type of life. So you have avian humans, you have simian humans that actually look more like monkeys than we do, you have some that have faces like felines, some that have faces like birds. They actually look like a bird head on a human body. Some of them look like reptilian heads on human bodies, some of them have insect heads on human bodies. All these different types are out there. And it seems that different types that look more alike tend to stick together more. And that includes the reptilians, which happen to be the bad guys in the story. It sounds cliche, it just happens to be true. So these people have been floating around in the cosmos for a really long time, and they got very highly evolved to such an extent that they communicate by micro-voltage changes in the glow on their face that's like broadband internet. So they can communicate much faster than speaking, and that's why for people like us to try to talk to these guys, it's almost impossible. They can't even imagine trying to speak in regular speech, like at the speed that we do. It would be way too slow. So here's a list. That guy down there on the bottom left is us. That's 6, means 6 feet in height. These are all different types of giant skeletons that have been found on Earth in terms of their heights. Goes up to 36 feet. So there have been certain burial sites in which 36-foot skeletons have been found. One of the insiders I just met actually got to talk to one of these giants and found out that there are 3 different major types of giant species that came to the planet from 3 different locations. There's a group that's in the sort of 7 to 9 foot range. There's a group that's in the sort of 12 to 13 foot range. And then there's a group that's around the 36 foot range, and if you see ones that are shorter than that, they're most likely children of the adults. Now, there's the different lineup of what we got. So you could see some of these giants would be extremely tall and threatening to us as little guys there on the left. But now these folks are called, in the insider world, the world of the Illuminati, they call them the progenitors. Those are the guys that are 70 to 100 feet tall. That would be a 70-foot humanoid there on the right. And there is us. Now, what I'm telling you is, yeah, everybody's standing up. You see that? It's a dramatic moment. I love it. That little pipsqueak over there on the left is the height that we have now. Now imagine that our space program, we start building ships that can travel out of the solar system. You know that they exist. You know that they got the Roswell crash, right? You know they reverse engineered it. You know about Area 51. Don't you think they'd fly into space? Don't you think they'd want to see some stuff out there once they got out there? Guess what they found? They found all kinds of build-outs inside moons and inside asteroids predominantly, where the entire room is built for people that are that large. Now, imagine walking into a room where the countertops alone are like 40 feet high, and the windows are up above where the countertops are. For whatever found, apparently has had a lot of it cleared out. All the original equipment has been removed, probably because of scavengers, bone pickers. So a lot of what we find out there is big, giant, empty rooms that are massive in size with very massive doors that are like 100 feet tall. There's still, in some cases, machines that still work inside these facilities built by these very large extraterrestrials they call the progenitors. Now, what we know is that the progenitors came in from the exterior of our solar system. So the oldest stuff with the tallest people is in places like the Oort cloud outside Neptune and Pluto. And then they started to settle in the moons of Neptune, Pluto, and the gas giants there. And they worked their way in over time. So here's the sun, accurately sized, relevant to the planets. And they moved their way in. As I've been saying, the majority, according to the insiders I've spoken to, the majority of all the moons in our solar system have some degree of ancient bases inside them for people that are very, very tall. And in many cases, those bases have then been reoccupied later on. Because beings like these progenitors will come through and they'll build things out, they'll live here for a while, and then they mothball it and they go somewhere else. And then maybe for them, what might be just a few years, for us could be millions of years, they eventually come back and they reoccupy the facility again. So these facilities are ready to go. So in a lot of cases, we just fly in and we start building out what's already been built there, and it saves us an awful lot of time. So these are some selected moons of our solar system with the Earth there placed for scale. You can see there's some really large stuff. The moons of Jupiter, Io, Europa, Ganymede, Callisto, pretty large. And you can see Saturn has a bunch of really large moons in the middle there. Uranus has several really large moons. Neptune has one really big one called Titan. And then you have some asteroids that are pretty large, etc., etc. So let's start from how our progenitors, as they're called, came in. They came in, and Neptune has a moon system, which I'm showing you now. And this is just to give you the sense of some of the stuff that's out there. All these different moons, or at least most of them from what I've been told from different people, and I got to combine it all together, most of these moons have settlements on them. Gigantic rooms inside. Uranus has a very robust moon system. Tons of moons around Uranus. They even just found 2 new ones, as you can see in this diagram. And a lot of these moons apparently have bases inside them of some magnitude. And these are some of the larger moons of Uranus. Again, probably extensive facilities inside most of these places. Now, Uranus's moon Miranda is a very curious example in which perhaps some of the ancient build-out is still visible to us. Because do you notice that strange boomerang shape on the moon? You see that? Well, let's take a closer look at that. That's actually what we see. That is Miranda. So there is something very bizarre there. Here it is tilted on a different angle. Now, this looks like it could that is a ridge or an escarpment that you're seeing there on the left. It's the tallest ridge in the solar system of any of the moons. There's a clear geometric structure there, which you can see based on the triangles that I put in on the right. Now, is it possible that we are seeing the underlying geometric structure that was built inside this moon, and that over the millennia, as the dust has gotten worn off by asteroid collisions, we're starting to see the superstructure that's hidden inside? And also over here we see very clear geometric shapes. Again, why wouldn't they build a geodesic inside? Now, this is what I've been told by one of the insiders, one of the original insiders, was that some of these moons, the entire inside has an atmosphere. And there is something like a geometric object, like those platonic solids, and you actually see trees and lakes, and there's an artificial sun, and you can fly around inside that moon, and you can pilot the moon anywhere you want to go, and it's like a whole world built inside of it. That's an advanced, obviously very advanced technology that apparently is all over the place. Now, Saturn has a whole bunch of moons. Look at all these moons. And as I said, probably the majority, based on what many insiders have told me, the majority of these moons have some kind of build-out in them already. And we have been out there and investigated a majority of this and looked for what we can find. Now, Saturn's moon Mimas, which is sort of closer to it, meaning it's going to be warmer there, is a curiously similar shape to the Death Star, and this was actually mentioned by the Daily Mail, which is probably part of a programmed disclosure. Now, you see that it actually looks a lot like something that George Lucas put into his movie. How did he get this idea? Well, maybe he got it from somebody on the inside, because it looks pretty darn similar. And remember, this is most likely an artificial world inside something that looks like a moon, which is exactly what the Death Star was in Star Wars. It even has similar structures on the surface. And if that's not weird enough, based on any conventional knowledge of physics, what we should see inside that moon is that the heat is going to be the strongest on the part of the moon that faces the planet, right? So that the planet's radiant heat is warming up the moon there. What we actually see is exactly the opposite. We see that the part that's facing Saturn is colder, and the part away from Saturn is warmer. And look at how it's got this sort of Pac-Man shape. Now imagine, if you will, that this is one of those moons that has an entire civilization already built inside of it, and everybody is living inside the yellow part. And then most of the hollow interior of the moon would be the sky for them. And then where that circle is, as you can see on the bottom, would be approximately where the sun, the fake sun, would be. You could have a whole world of people living inside this object, hiding from their enemies. Because these people, remember, were a prison colony. They were in trouble, and they were sent here to reform, and they also had enemies, and they were really worried about being attacked. So then we have another moon around Saturn that also has this very strange temperature anomaly. Same thing, Tethys. Again, it doesn't seem to make sense, but maybe one explanation is that this is where the civilization is, and that it's still in operation. Apparently there's a lot of people here in our solar system even now. And so the mainstream media, of course, calls it Pac-Man, right? Just to try to make light of it, but then they're getting you to ask questions. And Blinky is nowhere to be seen. Oh my goodness gracious. Now, also around Saturn, we have Enceladus, and this also is a very, very curious thing. Now, on the left, we're going to come back to this in a little while, is a weird square that's on the moon. But then the one on the right is this weird square that's on Saturn's moon Enceladus. Squares are not supposed to show up in nature. But it would be something you'd expect to see in the case of an ancient geometric build-out. So that's very curious. Now, what happens when we look at this curiously square area? Well, the curiously square area has curious heat that's not supposed to be there in exactly the square shape. You see that down there on the bottom right? And then, it's not what's supposed to be there. When we look at it up close, it has a striated structure, which would totally be what you'd expect if this particular habitat is built to have a series of long hallways so that everybody gets windows. so that it's not all just one big giant room, but that you have these developments. Now that looks like an artificial and intelligently built structure to me, because you got straight lines and 90-degree turns, suggesting a massive, massive station has been built inside, and it's down at the polar region, and that's where all the heat is, because that's where everybody's keeping the bills paid and keeping the heat on. Now, one of the insiders, when I showed this to him, he told me that that image looks exactly like what we see when we use various classified means such as LIDAR, radar, and thermal collage to look at actual underground facilities here on Earth. It's a very, very similar pattern to the underground bases that we have. Now, Saturn also has another moon, Iapetus, that has some weird stuff going on, and it's the one that is, let me make sure I'm right here, yep, it's the one that's on that really, really wide arc, so it goes far away from Saturn, as you can see right here. There's Iapetus. Now, this is some photographs that were taken from Cassini, which swung by several years ago, and this was work done by Richard Hoagland back in 2006, where he looks at Iapetus and says, oh my gosh, it's not a perfect sphere, it's all funny looking, and it has this ridge exactly along the midpoint, along the equator. What the heck is that thing doing there? Moons are not supposed to have a gigantic ridge that goes across the entire central axis of the middle of the planet, but if you superimpose your latitude and longitude lines, it's right there. That is exactly what we would expect if this thing has been built like a clamshell that's got two halves, and it's all artificial inside, okay? So that's not something we would expect, and there's even more weird fringe benefits with this moon. When we look at how the sun reflects across its surface, we see very strange geometric oddities. It is not a nice smooth curve. It's got geometric straight line dents on it. Check that out. I was really impressed with Richard when he did this, and I think that the insider guy that I'm in contact with leaked some of this to him, as well as him doing it through his own work. So you can see that there is a geometric structure, almost like, because it's so old, that it's kind of collapsed in on itself, and the original parts of the moon that were all dust have probably blown away or gotten impacted by asteroid collisions, things like that. And then as the sunlight plays across the surface of Iapetus, which remember still has that central equator as well, you see different types of straight line geometry. That is not what it should look like. But that is what we would expect if it's a gigantic base of massive proportions like the Death Star, which was being rebuilt in Return of the Jedi. So there it is again. Now, this was Richard's conception of what it might look like inside, underneath all the dirt. And I don't think that's too far from the truth. I think that's basically what these look like, and that was what he was nudged to think by the insider. And the idea here is that at some point, this group, which probably had a population of hundreds of billions of people at the apex of their civilization, their enemies came back and they got wiped out. The space program people have traveled to the face on Mars, to the pyramids on Mars, and from what they've told me, these structures are there, but they are under a great deal of sediment. There was a massive catastrophe that hit Mars that wiped them out, and that is described in the Law of One as having happened approximately 200,000 of our years ago. And the planet that exploded, they said, was more like 800,000 years ago. So it's interesting to note that the shape of this five-sided pyramid has the human proportion built into it, suggesting it was built by humans who look like us. Because there's the Vitruvian Man that just drops right in perfectly into the shape of that pyramid. Isn't that interesting? There's all kinds of very strange and wonderful mathematical relationships between this five-sided pyramid and the surrounding geometry on the plateau. I'm not going to bore you with all that, and we don't have enough time. That's Richard Hoagland's thing. I highly recommend reading his book, The Monuments of Mars, because that is the best source for all of that information. Then NASA comes out in 1998 and tries to debunk this whole thing by releasing what Art Bell called the cat box, in which they washed out the blacks and whites, they washed out the contrast, and sent us this image on the left to say, all these people that think it's a face, they don't know what they're looking at. That was disinformation, folks. That thing on the left doesn't look anything like what I showed you and the very beautiful shadows that it cast on the original NASA slides. Why? Because they don't want us to know that they already have a base on Mars. They've had it since the Nazis originally settled on Mars, believe it or not, as early as the late 1930s, early 1940s. The Nazis had already landed on Mars. They had some huge problems. They tried originally to settle around the equator, but there's these electrical storms that EMP'd all their systems, fried their systems. So now apparently the bases they build are around the North Pole, the pole, top and bottom pole, but especially the North Pole. And they have a facility there on Mars that has 200,000 personnel. And only 10,000 of those people are actually born on Earth. And it's apparently expanding very rapidly from what I've been hearing. So one of our earlier space program insiders, Henry Deacon, talked about this Mars city that they've got up there, which is one of the basic places that people end up going if you go into the space program. Now, this is an enhanced image to show the contrast, but what we see here are these glass tubes, which may be lava tubes, but they're probably the result of intelligent construction for what would amount to underground trains, because this civilization was an underground civilization they built after the surface of Mars had been largely destroyed in the explosion. They had a lot of facilities already there. The explosion probably blew up some of them, and they built more, and then they built the face and pyramids and actually recolonized the surface of the planet. So these do look like glass, and that would be what we'd expect to see if they had gigantic underground boring machines that bored their way through all that material. So this civilization, this renegade group we call the progenitors, according to the military insider, Richard Hoagland's top insider, this military group, the progenitor people were on the run. They were criminals, and they were sent to our solar system. This was their place of refuge and escape. And they colonized our fourth planet, which is Electra or Tiamat. And this planet was where they grew to ultimately at least 100 billion people, and probably a lot more than that. They were all in the 70 to 100 foot tall range. They're very large, and a larger planet supports a larger body, so this all makes sense. So Mars would have been a much smaller moon compared to the size of this planet. Now, again, it was originally a moon, and then after the planet, it probably had some settlement. Well, the big planet was settled, and then after the big planet totally exploded, some of the settlers on Mars survived. So that might be the size of Mars compared to the original super Earth. It was very large. Now, here's the thing. This is a very essential point. Saturn apparently did not originally have its rings. This is one of the weird things that Hoagland's insider told me. Saturn originally just looked like Uranus or Neptune. There was no rings around it. What we did see was that these 70 feet tall people were building a gigantic ring out of some sort of super duper material that kind of looks like glass, but is apparently some advanced alloy that they were processing the raw materials from moons that they were mining and then building this ring out of using advanced robotics. It was a transparent aluminum of some kind. And what they did is they built this gigantic ring that was polarized, so even though it looks like glass, light could come in from certain angles, but not all angles. So you could control who gets to see inside. And they were building this as a huge structure that people could actually live in, so that it was essentially a colony. Well, now here's the problem. These people are criminals. These people are wanted criminals, and they're very angry because they've suffered huge losses in war, and they do not forgive and they do not forget. So the people that were on their case still wanted to kick their ass, and they wanted to kick ass as well. It turns out that if you build a ring around a gigantic planet like a gas giant, you have a weapon using the same technology as the Tesla earthquake machine. You familiar with that? Where Tesla goes like this, and you keep doing it, and it's like those Roman soldiers that go across the bridge, right? And if they all are marching the same way, what happens? The bridge starts shaking like crazy. Well, if you start pulsing the planet, you can get this wave bigger and bigger, and then you can actually direct the beam to anywhere in the galaxy and frickin' blow up an entire planet, just explode the whole planet. They had gotten this thing 2/3 of the way done. They're saying, hey, we're just building a nice old housing complex, y'all. And the other enemies that they had, which were probably also very negative ETs, let's be honest, did not like this one bit. So what we heard was that their enemies came into town and took a look at this. Now, I'm just trying to give you an idea of what a glass structure would be like, but remember, this thing was shattered and it was exploded, so there's still pieces of this, tons and tons and tons of pieces of this kind of stuff floating around, toppling end over end in Saturn's rings. And there's an area where you can see the chunks. And our space program people have been out there and they've looked at the chunks quite extensively. You got chairs, control panels, consoles, and technology built for people 70 feet tall, all made out of glass. And apparently some of it still has working technology. So you can imagine that something that's almost entirely built out of this weird transparent glass would look very cool. And again, these people had extremely advanced technology, way beyond what we have. So the interior of this structure would have been quite something to behold. Very futuristic, very sleek, probably areas like this, all kinds of cool stuff. This is about the best looking things I could find on the internet to try to give you an idea of what this might look like if you could have seen it in its original form inside. Now, as I said, they could use this ring to create a big giant pulse wave and destroy any planet in the galaxy, and therefore it was felt they had to be stopped. So a massive attack was waged against them, and it destroyed their entire civilization. The ring was shot, and the ring exploded, and based on what Richard's insider and his people, which is basically the U.S. government faction, what they believe is that the planet was attacked as well as the ring at the same time, and they actually blew up the planet and blew up the ring simultaneously, and probably blew up some of the moons they had as well. So when that planet was blown up, when the ring was blown up, the insider told me that the shattered glass remnants that they've gone out and looked at are in the B ring, which, as you can see, is in the middle, right next to that big gap in between the two largest rings you see on Saturn. So there's the B ring in the middle. Now, you see where it says clumpy texture in the B ring? That is the remains of the original ring, and then as it broke apart and the dust spread out, the dust made all the other rings, which are very thin. So most of that stuff is all just fine, fine, fine shattered glass. But you see those lumps? You see how they're actually casting shadows against the rest of the rings? All of that stuff, if you fly up to it up close, is chunks of glass habitation. This is what I was told. He told me this on the phone, then I went and looked at it for myself. And our people have been out there, and at some point when disclosure happens, all of this is going to be told to us. And so they said, well, David, we want guys like you to tell the public first. Let's see how they respond. Let's see if they freak out. Can they handle it? What do they think? Nobody's freaking out. There's a couple people that are going out because they got to go to the bathroom, but I don't see anybody screaming, oh my God! All right, you can handle the truth. We'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, I mean, this is cool stuff for me. I love this stuff. This is an actual NASA diagram of what they are saying that those ice boulders actually look like. They're not ice, and they're not boulders. They're actually the remnants of the progenitors. And remember, look at how tiny we are compared to them. So there's not a lot of use that we're going to get out of these structures unless we build rooms that are a lot smaller than what they needed originally when they built that glass ring. So Tiamat or Electra exploded, and here's the thing. Our Earth's moon was the crown jewel of their entire collection. The moon was actually an ancient build-out. I have been told by almost everybody who's a space program insider across the board, the entire interior of our moon, all the way around, 360 degrees in every direction, 20 to 50 miles deep, and it's all hollow, and it's all loaded with rooms for these 70-foot tall progenitor people inside. The whole interior of the moon. That trips me out. And apparently their technology was so advanced that when they saw that their planet was going to be destroyed, they had an object that was made of nanotechnology the size of a baseball, and they portaled it way back into the past. And then in the past, it actually time traveled. It lands, and these little nano robots go in, and they build out the whole interior into this super advanced base. And then it just so happens that that moon is now ready to go right when they need it, because now the moon has changed. They've changed the timeline, and that build-out is now ready for them, even though they sent the baseball back, let's say, many millions of years ago, maybe even over 100 million years. So there was a last-minute effort to flee inside the moon. Apparently billions of them managed to get in at the last minute, but the moon, even so, was heavily damaged as they fled. They could drive the moon away from the damage, but the problem is there were chunks of their original planet, which we now call asteroids, flying around everywhere, and they were getting hit. Boom, 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 boom. So they took a lot of damage, and a lot of that ancient base inside was destroyed. So what they did, the ones of them who lived through this, which apparently was not that many, they flew the moon out of the asteroid debris field, but this is a problem because the sun has a lot of gravity. So they either fall into some kind of gravitational capture or they get sucked into the sun. And they got to make a quick decision. So they did the calculations, and the best planet to go to was Earth. Now at this point, Earth was a swamp. It wasn't a place you'd want to be. It wasn't a good place to live on at the time. So what they did is they put the moon into an orbit around the Earth, which does what to the ocean? Creates tides. Tides start to generate life a lot more than what they had before. So this jump starts the works on the planet, which up until then it was really kind of a dump. And you had a bunch of big lizards going around, and it wasn't anywhere near what it could be. So they started to terraform at this point. The moon was heavily damaged on the inside. There were bodies everywhere. It was horrible. They lost a lot of their technology. This is one of the things we've heard, is that after the moon went out there, they resettled on Mars, and they got shorter. Their height starts to drop. So this appears to be when they go down to about the 36-foot range and lower. So they lose their height, and they've got bodies all over the place inside, and it stinks. It's horrible. There's flies. It's just disgusting. So they have to resettle on the surface of the moon by building domes out of that same glass or something similar that they could still do, and they rebuilt their civilization in glass domes on the surface. At this point, they had trees and plants and all kinds of cool things under the glass on the moon. So the moon was like a really nice place to live. And they start traveling to the Earth as giant humans compared to what was native on Earth, which was probably just like caveman. And they began creating huge cities. And as the tides on the Earth kind of jump-started everything, and as the conditions got better, they eventually built an enormous civilization on Earth in what we now think of as Northern Africa. And that is the area that you see here as the Sahara Desert and Saudi Arabia, the whole Persian Gulf, and then on up even into the Carpathian Mountains up there. Now, there's kind of a problem here, isn't there? What does it look like right now? It's like a big old wasteland of nothing. Well, it turns out that these people still could not get over their warlike ways. They still wanted to kick ass. They still wanted to kill people. And eventually their enemies came and wiped them out again. And one of the most fascinating things the insiders told me is, forget about even leaving the Earth. If you're a treasure hunter and you want to find good stuff, all you got to do is have the advanced satellite technology they already possess and start digging down in the desert, the Sahara. You could go as little as 40 feet down, sometimes up to 200-300 feet of sand down, and there is an extraordinary amount of technologically advanced artifacts down there. They're everywhere. The Egyptians then ended up eventually living on what was the surviving highlands, the only part that was left after this war, which was actually where the Great Pyramid is, where the Sphinx is, right up there, at the top of the Persian Gulf, right up there between Saudi Arabia and Africa. That little tiny part was the highest area, and that's where civilization clung to. Now, these people obviously got blown up. This is what I was told. And apparently they still survived. Some of their descendants still survived, and they've been keeping themselves a secret. So a lot of this stuff about the moon is stuff they don't want us to know because they're still afraid that they're going to be isolated and attacked. They still think we're going to treat them as villains and criminals and want to kill them. So this appears to be one of the reasons why all this evidence about the moon has been suppressed, and one of Richard Hoagland's insiders, this NASA engineer Ken Johnston, was ordered to destroy all these original prints from Apollo that had things from the moon on them. And this is a conference at the National Press Club that they did that was covered by the Russian media. The American media wouldn't touch it. Now, NASA apparently concluded that we can't handle the truth. And just to make the point, I'm going to show you him. You can't handle the truth. Okay, guys, sure. Nobody's screaming. Nobody's running out of the room. But it was decided that you couldn't handle the truth. So then what we have is this Brookings Institution report that said that mankind might topple if we were faced by a race of superior beings. So they felt that we couldn't be told because our civilization and our way of life would collapse. Now, one of the coolest things that Ken Johnston found out, and other researchers that came after him, was that NASA apparently used frame 4822 to store multiple versions of the same image. And when you ordered 4822, usually it came out black. But what this guy Alex Cook started to do is he starts to order multiple copies of 4822. And apparently whoever was in the records room at NASA hadn't been vetted out on the idea that there's multiple versions of 4822 and was never told not to send them out. So as they ordered multiple versions of 4822, we get this building on the surface of the moon, one of the original buildings that the descendants of the progenitors built. It's still there. It's all made out of glass. Tell me that that thing is some kind of natural formation. I don't think so. There's a reason why they hid this from us, and doesn't it sound a lot like that base on the bottom of Saturn's moon Enceladus? Notice again, I said that there was that ribbed pattern on the base, and then we see something looking pretty darn similar to that on the surface of the moon, probably made out of glass. Now, the insiders in the space program who I've talked to have said that there are all kinds of glass ruins still on the moon, and they leave them intact so that people can go out and visit them and be reminded of these wars that they had millennia ago so that they won't keep making war with each other. On the dark side of the moon, which is never going to face the Earth, right? Because the moon, even though the light moves across it, it's always facing us in the same direction. That back side is called the dark side of the moon. We never can see it unless somebody had a satellite that could photograph the back. Well, who has all the satellites? NASA. NASA was chartered as a defense agency of the United States government. So they have the right and the need to classify information that they feel would threaten national security. So they don't want to tell you about this. This little dome is also on the same frame, 4822. And as you can see, this is one of those original glass domes, apparently, that is still there, that got out largely untouched, because what we've been told is that enemies of these people who were still making war came back again. They blasted the moon. They hit it, actually, with a projectile that was the size of an 18-wheeler truck going 3/4 the speed of light. And it hit that moon, and it just damaged it like crazy, shattered all the glass, and apparently we think that the civilization around the Sahara Desert was wiped out dramatically at the same time. Now, this is one of the interesting ones that Richard thinks is a dome, where we enhance the contrast around this picture from Apollo 12, and look at that weird thing that we see behind him when you amplify the contrast. Now, that's pretty trippy. However, most likely that's just a lens flare, so I'm not convinced by that one. I just want to be clear on that. But that just kind of gives us an idea of what might be there. But this one is really cool. On July 20th, 1965, the Russians sent a probe called Zond 3 to go around the moon, and as the edge of the moon was coming up, you see things like this tower that shows up. That tower is huge. You see it there in the middle of the diagram? And then as it rotates a little bit more, and the tower goes out of view, you get this big glass dome that shows up. And it's very clear. So that's probably some of the best evidence we have right there. Here's another example in which, if you look in the visor glass of this Apollo 12 astronaut on frame AS12-18-7071, in the visor there appears to be the reflection of something in the background that he was looking at that they were deliberately not letting us see, which is labeled as an artifact up there on the right. Now again, we don't know if that's real or if that's just some glint on his helmet, but it's another intriguing possibility that Hoagland looked at. Now this is Edgar Mitchell in front of what may be a very massive glass superstructure, because when you enhance the contrast, there's geometric patterns and straight lines and all kinds of weird looking stuff that you see up there above the moon. And especially as you see these different enhancements, and this is a paper I co-authored with Richard to commemorate him being picked up by the Russian media, you can see that it is very glass-like, especially on the bottom right. And you can see some of the facets inside the glass. Very, very interesting. This is another thing Richard found, which clearly looks like some sort of weird technological artifact like an antenna that has been built onto the surface of the moon. Here is another one in which there was the sun setting, and as the sun set, the light temporarily caught these glass ruins, which normally there shouldn't be anything there above the surface. It should just be black space. But as the sun was setting, the sunlight hit the glass at the right angle that you see something like this. Now, the insiders have told me that when you look at it from, if you're in the space program and you're flying around the moon, you'll see towers that are kind of bent and twisted and bent over. And because this impact was so strong, they're shattered, they're damaged, and a lot of the damage has been left behind as sort of like a museum memorial. And so every now and then some of this stuff shows up. Now this is another one that really trips me out. All the other arrows, you know, he's looking at the fact that there's some weird changes in contrast there. But this thing on the left is what trips me out. There's clearly some kind of rod, some kind of what he calls a structural support that appears to have bent, and it is lying against the mountainside there. Now this is an undoctored, unretouched NASA photograph. Does that look like something that would be a natural formation to you? I don't think so. That looks like rebar or some kind of support beam that fell and landed on that little mountain there. And this is another image apparently taken by the Russians from the moon's surface. Oh yeah, that's just that geological thing that happens when the lava bubbles up and it just happens to look like the ruined foundation of an old square building. No, I don't think so. You having fun? Are you liking this? Is this tripping you out or what? You think was this a good idea to be here? I think so. All right. Now, this is the grand poobah of all of it right here. The largest plane on the moon is not an impact crater. Now here it says in the Nature Science Journal, gravity data suggest flats of volcanic basalt formed from tectonic stretching, which is a lot of gobbledygook to explain that there is a gigantic frickin' square made out of the craters that we see every time we look at the moon. When you look at it, you see that if you tilt it a little bit different from where we see it on Earth, you got the man on the moon there, he's got the big head, and then he's got that little trail of him throwing toys into his bag, right? That's what they always used to call it in the astronomy magazines I had. He's throwing toys into his bag, but the toy path over the top of his head there is actually the top of a square. And so what we're seeing here, and there's the Space.com calls it a strikingly geometric shape hidden on the surface of the moon. That's that red box. That's a square. That's the angle of the moon as we see it from Earth. And they've known this, obviously, because they've been sending people up to the moon ever since at least Apollo and Mercury. Now they decide to tell us 40 years later? Why did they wait so long? You can't handle the truth, right? Well, now they think you can. So what is this really saying? When you see this huge frickin' square, or what they're actually calling a rectangular structure, this suggests that it's artificial, that somebody built it, that the moon might be a massive technological artifact. And look at that. I mean, that diagram right there, you see the square so clearly. It's just so obvious. Just like, as I said, these square craters on Eros 433, same thing. So that square literally covers a huge portion of the moon's entire surface, and it may be the exposed substructure of what is inside the moon as the dust gets blown off. It may be that it's almost like a balloon, and as craters hit the moon, they're bouncing off of this thing, kicking the dust up, and now what you see is the seas or the mares is the remaining superstructure once all the dust has been cleared away. And it definitely shows us the square shape in the underlying geometry that it was made from. So we were only told, humanity was only told, that the moon has a gigantic geometric shape, a perfect square, as of October 1st, 2014. So it seems that somebody is doing disclosure deliberately and getting us to know things. And we see that these people that came from the moon and landed on Earth apparently started to harm people on Earth very significantly and treat us as slaves, and they were cannibals. They were eating people on Earth, and as a result they got savagely attacked. Their encampment, the moon was totally wiped out, as I said, all the glass shattered, and their big civilization in the Sahara Desert was totally wiped out. As I said, the moon was hit by an 18-wheeler sized projectile going 3/4 the speed of light. This is all part of the disclosure I was given. All the glass domes completely shattered. And so this is the shattered leftovers, like you're seeing here as the sun is setting on the horizon. The shattered leftovers of the glass that still can be seen. The entire northern third of Africa was completely wiped out in the blast, leaving behind what we now call the Sahara Desert. You dig down 40 to 300 feet, and there's all kinds of toys there. Now notice, this is the only part of the Earth that looks like that. Do you see that? It's this big, huge desert. Like everything else has been undisturbed, and probably if you waited another 500,000 years or something, it's going to come back. But this is only about, we estimate, based on multiple insiders I've talked to and trying to thread it with what was said in the Edgar Cayce readings and what was said in the Law of One, it appears that this happened 50,000 years ago. That this was the first big Atlantis on Earth that was wiped out 50,000 years ago, which both books, both the Edgar Cayce readings and the Law of One, point to a major war around that time that took place. As I said, the highlands of the original civilization was Egypt, and so they then built out stuff over what was originally there. So the Sphinx appears to be a recarving of an older monument, and the Great Pyramid is built on a big ridge of rock underneath. So as I said before, there's tons of technological artifacts under there, 30 to 400. I have to change that data based on new information. And the Egyptian priesthood went around and found some of these old books from people who were out there in our solar system were losing light. That's kind of interesting. So maybe they're trying to tell me something, that we're running out of time here. How much time do we have? We're actually 9 minutes past where we would be. Anyway. Yeah, we got more to do. So So what we find out is that the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was the storehouse for all these archaeological expeditions they were doing, finding these books that were made out of pages of almost unbreakable material, like made out of something like Kevlar. And that the books were then stored in the Library of Alexandria, which once it was invaded by the Romans, they did a false flag, and they burned only things like census documents and tax forms and kept all the good stuff and brought it to, guess where? The Vatican Library. So one of my oldest insiders, Dr. Pete Peterson, was invited to go to the Vatican Library and allowed to read some of these old books, and he said that some of them had like barcodes on them, and all it was digital-looking code on every page. Some of them had very elaborate images of spaceships and space stations and bases inside moons and all this stuff. And the Egyptian priests had been able to translate some of this stuff, and so there were also books of translations in ancient Egyptian language and Greek and Roman, things like this, of what the actual original books said. So the books tend to have a solid color on them, like you'll have a blue cover or a red cover that's all leather. The books tend to have a buckle on them, so you actually can buckle it like your pants to keep it closed. And again, most of the pages are kind of like an off-white color, and they're made of some kind of indestructible material. There's also a whole series of books that are made out of metallic plates that have engravings on them. So this is something that's being kept in the Vatican Library. They don't want us to know because it has the history of these people. Now, if you hear about the Illuminati, if you watch the movie Eyes Wide Shut, you hear about something called the Saturn cult and the Festival of Saturnalia. Why? Because these people trace themselves back to the progenitors who had originally settled on Saturn. So if you look in Eyes Wide Shut, when they're all wearing the masks, they do this dance where they go around in a circle, and that emulates the rings of Saturn orbiting. Because they trace themselves as the descendants of Saturn, and they believe that they're different from the rest of us, that they have extraterrestrial DNA that made them the gods. And that kind of is segueing into the next part of our talk. So there were a very small number of survivors when the moon was blown up, and they got out with only, apparently the story is, the moon was so badly hit that only a few of their damaged spacecraft got out, and their civilization on Earth was almost completely wiped out, so just a small number of them made it, and they crash-landed on Earth. And they then interbred with humans, which they were specifically warned not to do, and this created what we call in the book of Enoch, the fallen angels. Their offspring, their children most likely, the hybrids of their own form, which was about 36 feet tall, and native people on Earth, became these 12 to 13 foot tall, red-headed, white-skinned humans. And white skin was not normal for the Earth. And this is preserved in a book that the Vatican did not want you to read, that wasn't even found until the 1800s, but it's very old. It's as old as the book of Genesis, called the Book of Enoch. It's a very, very important text. And I'm going to be doing a lot more about this as I go on, probably writing it into my books. The Scottish explorer James Bruce discovered several copies of it in Ethiopia in 1773. It was translated in 1821, and Jesus quotes from this book in the New Testament, so he obviously thought it was pretty important. The key chapters are chapters 1 through 36, called the Book of the Watchers, and it says that this man, Enoch, was Noah's grandfather, and that he lived for 365 years, so he was some kind of extraterrestrial. Enoch acts as a messenger for what appear to be benevolent extraterrestrials who had threatened these people on Earth, the Watchers, with total destruction that became Noah's flood. But before the flood, before their civilization was wiped out again, because we're now talking about 12,000 years ago, the big Atlantean flood, they used Enoch as a messenger to kind of cut a deal with the good guys, the benevolent ETs, and say, would you please not destroy us? In this book, the Book of Enoch, it says that there was only 200 of them that descended. They became the fallen angels. Lucifer was one of the fallen angels, interestingly enough. He was the leader. The insiders I've spoken to have said it's probably a lot more than 200, that they had interbred here for some time. They had huge population numbers again, and this event, Noah's flood, completely wiped them out. Now, Enoch 7:3 says that their height was 3,000 ells. Some of the research that's been done on this suggests we're in the 12 to 13 foot range with that. It says in 7:5-6 that they were cannibals. They began eating us. And they begged God for forgiveness in 13:4, and they were turned down, obviously. And then a great flood was created to cleanse the earth of these so-called Watchers, which they're still pissed off about and still punishing us for all these years later. Because we, i.e. non-extraterrestrial humans, were God's chosen, and they were the fallen angels, the cast-outs, So now they feel like they need to get revenge on us and that we are the wicked and they are the just. And what does the Bible say? That the money will be taken from the wicked and given to the just. Well, that's how they justify the economic redistribution that they've done with things like the Federal Reserve, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements. Now you see why I wanted to leak this all on stage at once. Okay? Stuff like this. But some of these people never died out completely. In fact, they've been around up until very recently in some cases. Let's look at the example of Easter Island. Jacob Roggeveen and C.F. Behrens, two Dutch explorers, visited there on Easter Island, first people from the West to get there, 1722. And when they got there, they saw 12-foot-tall white men with red hair that had long earlobes, just like you see in the sculptures. And then they were peacefully coexisting with the natives that were called Hanau Monoko. So you have these two different groups, Hanau Epe and Hanau Momoko. And the natives had shorter ears, darker skin, and a typical human height. So these giants actually spoke to the explorers. Apparently something happened afterwards where they were removed. And this brings us to a very interesting and highly controversial thing. It's probably going to get me in a lot of trouble, which is the subject of stasis beings. What the heck are stasis beings? Apparently, some of the oldest people who got to the Earth, and this may be the progenitors, we don't really know, they had a very advanced crystal technology, and they left these crystal artifacts all around the interior of the Earth, deep, deep underground, in underground bases and things like that, in some cases natural caverns. You have these crystals that in some cases will glow with a blue light, and they can actually effectively create a time bubble where time basically stops inside the bubble. So you can then get inside this bubble when you activate the crystal properly, and there's obviously some kind of like a timer so you can get set up properly and then wait for the time bubble to kick on, and then the time bubble essentially keeps you so that you only experience like a few weeks, but it could be thousands of years on Earth. Now, there are apparently at least a dozen different stasis being areas around the Earth, as well as others where the crystals collapsed and didn't work. One of these stasis being chambers was found in Ohio, and I have now called it the Illuminati Disneyland. The reason why I say this is that you go into this, there's a river in Ohio apparently, there's a mouth down at the bottom, a big cave opening, you go in there, you walk in a long way, and then eventually what you see is a room that's about 60 to 100 feet tall. It's a dome. It's got black tar painted around the inside. And in the middle are three sarcophagi that are in kind of a Y shape around this thing in the middle that's a big crystal hanging on these supports with 4 poles, 4 pillars. The crystal is glowing, and there's some kind of time bubble that you can't get through. It has like a gravitational field. So they had to climb up the side and build like a scaffolding so they could look down and see what was inside these sarcophagi. And what did they see? They saw apparently perfectly preserved giant humans who were around 12 feet tall, 3 of them, all males with red hair, long beards, and, of course, still in stasis and still sleeping. Yes. And here's the crazy part. All these Illuminati guys were going to see it, and they were writing their names on the side of the cave to kind of like tag it, like graffiti. And the name that a lot of people at the higher levels hear, the most notable name on that wall, guess who it was? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln saw the stasis beings at Illuminati Disneyland. Now imagine the power of being in this group where you are told that you are the descendants of these gods, and you can go to a site like this that has a clearly advanced technology. For people in the 1700s or the 1800s, they didn't have anything like a glowing light. They didn't even have electric light. They just had fire. You have this glowing crystal suspended with these weird like wires or something hanging off of these 4 posts in the middle, and these people in sarcophagi that are giants with red hair, and they're still sleeping, and they look like they could come back to life. So this is where the Illuminati legend came into play, that, hey, these are our ancestors. These are our own family members. And the curious part is that different stasis chambers have been found all over the Earth, and in the different areas we find different types of humanoid extraterrestrials. They're not all the same. So it seems like multiple different groups found these time crystals and built stasis chambers, and the belief also is that the crystals are programmed to end their stasis as this energetic activation takes place in our solar system. So the Illuminati belief also is that as we get to the end of the cycle, these beings will reawaken, and that is the return of their gods.